The humid Thai night pressed against the chain-link fence like a living thing, carrying the stench of jet fuel and burning rubber across Takli Royal Thai Air Force Base. Inside the operations bunker, young officers hunched over maps dotted with red pins, each one marking where another American convoy had been shredded by Soviet-supplied weapons. Moving invisibly down the Ho Chi Minh Trail, the fluorescent lights flickered as another flight of Thunderchiefs roared overhead, their afterburners painting orange streaks across the darkness, heading north toward targets they would hit for 3 violent minutes before fuel gauges forced them home. Washington wanted results, Moscow wanted deniability, and somewhere between those two capitals, men were dying in a war that officially didn't exist beyond the evening news. The radio crackled with pilot chatter, calm voices masking the terror of flying through walls of anti-aircraft fire, while in the Kremlin, Soviet generals studied the same maps and smiled at how their Zeal trucks and gas transports kept bleeding the Americans white. Nobody spoke about the real problem, the truth that sat like a stone in every briefing room from Saigon to the Pentagon. The faster the jets flew, the less they could see, and the enemy knew it. Moving at night when American technology turned blind, every sortie became a gamble, dropping bombs on suspected coordinates, while thousands of tons of Soviet ammunition rolled south under jungle canopy, protected by darkness and the tacit agreement between superpowers that this war must never quite escalate beyond control. The air crews returned exhausted, their aircraft riddled with shrapnel, knowing they had accomplished nothing that would appear in tomorrow's intelligence reports. Mechanics worked through the night patching holes, while engineers filed reports that vanished into classified folders, and the Ho Chi Minh Trail grew wider, busier, more lethal with each passing week. Captain Richard Tanner stood in the shadow of Revetment 7, watching another Thunderchief limp back from the north with its tail section shredded like tinfoil. The morning sun turned the tarmac into a shimmering mirror of heat, but he barely noticed, his engineer's mind already cataloguing the damage pattern, the way Soviet 12.7mm rounds had stitched a line from wingtip to fuselage. He'd been stationed at Takli for 8 months, long enough to recognize the signature of every weapon the Russians were feeding into North Vietnam, long enough to understand that speed had become America's curse rather than its advantage. The pilot climbed down, hands shaking as he lit a cigarette, not bothering to file the usual report because they all said the same thing now. Hit the target. Maybe. Take damage. Definitely. See the enemy. Never. Tanner approached the wounded aircraft like a surgeon examining a patient, running his fingers along the torn metal, feeling the heat still radiating from panels that had been virgin aluminum yesterday. Around him, mechanics worked with the resignation of men patching holes in a sinking ship, knowing tomorrow would bring fresh wounds, fresh failures. This wasn't engineering anymore, it was battlefield triage dressed up in technical language and classified memorandums that nobody in Washington actually read. The briefing rooms offered no comfort, just more evidence of a losing equation that everyone pretended might somehow balance itself through sheer repetition. Intelligence officers spoke in careful euphemisms about interdiction percentages and sortie effectiveness, words that meant nothing when Soviet trucks kept rolling and American body bags kept filling. Tanner had stopped raising his hand during meetings, stopped suggesting modifications that would slow the Thunderchiefs down, make them vulnerable, transform these sleek speed demons into something Washington never intended. But at night, alone in his quarters, with stolen technical manuals and hand-drawn schematics, his mind refused to surrender to institutional inertia. He thought about gunships, about the lumbering AC-47s that could loiter for hours, pouring fire into the darkness with a patience that jets could never afford. The Air Force had built the F-105 to penetrate Soviet airspace at near-sonic speeds, deliver a nuclear payload, and escape before the world ended. But this war demanded something different, something ugly and persistent that violated every principle of modern aerial warfare. His superiors would call it madness, a career-ending fantasy that contradicted decades of doctrine, and they would be absolutely right by every measure, except the one that mattered. The intelligence reports arrived in manila folders, stamped with classification levels that meant nothing anymore, because everyone from Saigon to the Pentagon knew the truth and simply refused to speak it plainly. Tanner spread the reconnaissance photographs across the plywood table in his makeshift workshop, black and white images captured by cameras that saw what pilots could never witness during daylight runs. Soviet ZIL-157 trucks moved in columns of 20 or more, their canvas-covered cargo beds concealing ammunition crates and artillery shells, manufactured in factories 10,000 miles away, where snow fell on assembly lines that never stopped feeding this war. The convoys traveled at night exclusively now, headlights blacked out, guided by North Vietnamese Army scouts who knew every crater and switchback along routes that American bombs had failed to permanently destroy. He traced the patterns with a pencil, connecting sightings from different nights, recognizing the disciplined rhythm of military logistics planned by advisors who understood supply chain warfare better than any general in Washington cared to admit. The photographs revealed more than just trucks and timing. They showed the evolution of an enemy, learning to survive American air power through simple adaptation. Gaz jeeps equipped with heavy machine guns bracketed each convoy, their crews trained by Eastern Bloc instructors who had survived German attacks on the Murmansk run and knew exactly how to position anti-aircraft weapons for maximum lethality against fast-moving targets. Tanner found himself respecting the tactical intelligence behind the deployments, the way Soviet doctrine emphasized redundancy and dispersion, making every supply run a self-contained defensive unit. His superiors dismissed these convoys as secondary targets compared to bridges and rail yards, infrastructure that could be marked on maps and briefed to congressmen, but infrastructure rebuilt itself with peasant labor and determination. While the real war flowed nightly through jungle roads nobody in America could locate without coordinates. He pulled out maintenance logs from the past 6 months, cross-referencing successful strikes against documented convoy movements, finding the damning correlation that made his chest tighten with frustrated certainty. The mathematics were brutally simple once you stopped lying to yourself with hopeful projections and mission success percentages. An F-105 Thunderchief traveling at 500 knots had perhaps 30 seconds over a target area before fuel. Considerations demanded it turn for home, 30 seconds to identify, attack, and assess, while traveling nearly 3 football fields every second. Soviet convoy commanders had figured this out by their 3rd month of operations. Now they simply dispersed at the sound of approaching jets, regrouped after the Americans vanished, continued their journey with acceptable losses that Moscow replenished faster than Tanner could calculate replacement rates. What the war needed wasn't speed, but presence, an aircraft that could circle above those jungle roads for hours, hunting with patient malice, turning every nighttime supply run into a mathematical certainty of destruction. The concept violated everything modern air combat represented. It meant transforming supersonic fighters into slow-moving gun platforms, making them vulnerable to the very defenses they were designed to outrun. Yet standing there in the humid darkness with reconnaissance photos showing another successful Soviet supply operation, Tanner understood that conventional wisdom had become America's most effective enemy, more dangerous than any missile system Khrushchev's engineers could design. The hangar sat 300 yards from the main flight line, a corrugated metal structure the Air Force had stopped using after monsoon floods left 2 feet of standing water that never quite dried, leaving behind the smell of rust and mildew that now provided perfect cover for what couldn't be explained in official reports. Tanner had chosen the location deliberately after 2 weeks of watching guard rotations and supply truck patterns, identifying the blind spot in base security where curiosity died behind paperwork nobody wanted to file. The damaged F-105D had been written off, after taking shrapnel over Hanoi, its fuselage peppered with holes that made it officially unflyable but structurally sound enough for someone willing to ignore regulations printed in manuals written by men who had never watched friends burn in wreckage scattered across jungle canopy. He had recruited carefully 3 mechanics who shared his frustration and possessed skills that existed outside standard training protocols. Men who understood that sometimes progress required forgetting what you'd been taught was impossible. They worked only during shift changes when supervisors were distracted, and flight operations created enough noise to mask the sound of metal-cutting torches and hydraulic systems being rerouted in ways Lockheed engineers never intended. The work became an obsession measured in stolen hours and borrowed equipment signed out under false maintenance orders, each modification pushing them further past the point where honest mistakes could save their careers. Nobody spoke about what would happen if they were discovered, because speaking it aloud meant acknowledging the court-martial waiting behind every unauthorized welding seam. The side-mounted cannon pods came from a weapons depot in Korat, where inventory controls had grown loose under the pressure of sustained operations that consumed materiel faster than paperwork could track. Sergeant Miller had connections with an ordnance chief who asked no questions when requisition forms listed replacement parts for aircraft that didn't technically exist in official registries anymore. They mounted the M61 Vulcan pods, where fuel tanks normally attached, compromising range for firepower in a trade-off that made Tanner's hands shake with equal parts excitement and terror at how completely this violated every doctrine written about fighter aircraft employment. The night optics proved harder to acquire until a crew chief from an AC-47 gunship unit mentioned damaged equipment awaiting depot-level repair that would likely be cannibalized for parts anyway. Tanner installed the scavenged infrared scope himself, working by flashlight in the cockpit while rain hammered the hangar roof and lightning illuminated his illegal modifications in stuttering bursts that felt like warnings from a universe trying to tell him something he refused to hear. The wiring looked like improvised circuitry from a science fiction film. Nothing that would pass safety inspection, everything that might actually work if luck and engineering skill aligned in the precise ratio required for miracles. He sat in the pilot seat afterward, hands on controls connected to systems that existed nowhere in technical orders, and felt the weight of what they'd created pressing against his chest like accumulated atmospheric pressure before storms break. Testing the modifications required deception layered upon existing lies, until Tanner could barely track which false maintenance logs covered which unauthorized activities in the conspiracy that had consumed his entire existence. They ran the Vulcan cannons during routine weapons testing when dozens of aircraft were cycling ammunition, the distinctive sound of 20mm rounds lost among similar thunder echoing across the flight line. The night optics he tested alone after midnight, powering up electrical systems while the aircraft sat dark in the hangar, watching heat signatures of wild animals moving through the jungle beyond the perimeter fence, and understanding with cold certainty that this crude equipment could distinguish truck engines from ambient temperature variations. His crew chief, a technical sergeant from Oklahoma named Davis, finally voiced what everyone was thinking while they were reinstalling access panels at 3 a.m. with fingers bleeding from metal edges and exhaustion making their movements clumsy. "Captain, we've built something that's either going to change this war or get us all locked in Leavenworth until we're old men telling stories nobody believes," he said quietly. And Tanner couldn't argue because both outcomes seemed equally probable, separated only by whether he had the courage to actually take this impossible machine into hostile airspace and prove that desperation could sometimes forge better weapons than entire engineering departments working from approved blueprints. The modified Thunderchiefs sat ready in its forgotten hangar, unauthorized and unblessed, waiting for a night when conviction would overcome self-preservation and one disillusioned engineer would gamble everything on a theory that conventional wisdom had already declared insane. The flight line emptied shortly after 2,300 hours when the last maintenance crews finished post-flight inspections and headed toward barracks, where exhaustion mattered more than the distant rumble of artillery that had become ambient noise nobody consciously heard anymore. Tanner waited in the operations shack, drinking cold coffee that tasted like metal, watching the duty officer nod off over paperwork, while static whispered through radio speakers, tuned to frequencies that would remain silent until dawn brought renewed sorties against targets that never seemed to diminish, no matter how many bombs fell. He had filed a flight plan listing a navigation training mission over neutral territory, the kind of routine paperwork that disappeared into filing cabinets without scrutiny because everyone was too busy managing actual combat operations to question a captain wanting extra cockpit hours. The authorization sat signed and stamped through bureaucratic momentum rather than genuine approval, official enough to provide cover but vague enough to deny institutional knowledge if everything collapsed into disaster. Walking toward the forgotten hangar felt like crossing a border between the military he had joined and the person necessity was forcing him to become, each step taking him further from regulations that had stopped making sense when measured against burning wreckage and casualty reports that climbed with mathematical predictability. He carried his helmet and survival vest, wearing his normal flight suit because anything unusual would invite questions he couldn't answer without revealing the modified Thunderchief waiting in darkness, like evidence of either brilliance or treason, depending on which prosecutor reviewed the facts. Davis had the aircraft ready, with ground power connected and systems running preliminary checks that showed amber indicators where green lights should have appeared because nothing about this machine conformed to standard parameters anymore. The sergeant's face looked hollowed out by weeks of clandestine work and the moral weight of enabling something that felt simultaneously necessary and completely insane when examined under the harsh illumination of military justice. All panels secured, guns loaded with 2,000 rounds, optics calibrated as best I could manage without actual test flights, he reported in a voice stripped of inflection, because admitting emotion meant acknowledging the terror underneath professional competence. Tanner gripped his shoulder briefly, the only communication possible between men who had conspired past, the point where words adequately captured shared risk or mutual understanding of consequences. He climbed into the cockpit, where improvised wiring and unauthorized equipment created a chaotic instrument panel that would have horrified safety inspectors, each toggle switch and circuit breaker representing decisions made in defiance of wisdom, accumulated through decades of aviation accidents. The canopy closed, with its familiar pneumatic hiss, sealing him inside a machine that existed in bureaucratic limbo, neither officially airworthy nor completely impossible, waiting only for engine ignition to transform theory into irreversible action. The modified Thunderchief rolled toward the runway under power that felt normal, despite everything else being profoundly wrong about this moment and the choices that had led to it. Tower cleared him for takeoff with bored efficiency, another aircraft among dozens, nobody recognizing that this particular machine carried modifications that would either validate desperate innovation or prove that some boundaries existed for legitimate reasons beyond mere institutional conservatism. He advanced throttles, feeling the familiar acceleration that always triggered primitive excitement despite years of experience that should have rendered routine flights unremarkable. Except tonight, nothing was routine, and the darkness ahead contained either vindication or catastrophic failure, with no middle ground between those extremes. The Thunderchief lifted off Tackley's runway, climbing toward stars obscured by monsoon humidity, banking westward over mountains where borders dissolved into jungle that belonged to no nation and every ideology simultaneously, territory where proxy wars happened in shadows while diplomats argued definitions, Tanner leveled at low altitude, descending below radar coverage, flying toward Laos, where intelligence reports had marked convoy routes with coordinates that represented not just military targets, but the entire theory he was betting his career and possibly his life upon. The night optics flickered to life, showing green-tinged landscapes sliding beneath him, primitive technology revealing heat signatures that standard equipment would have missed. And somewhere ahead, Soviet-supplied trucks were moving south carrying weapons that would kill Americans unless someone stopped them using methods that existed outside approved doctrine, which was exactly what he intended to do, regardless of what happened afterward, when explanations would be demanded by men who had never faced the particular desperation that turns rule-following engineers into midnight vigilantes, gambling everything on unauthorized solutions. The convoy appeared first as thermal ghosts flickering through his jury-rigged optics, 23 vehicles moving in disciplined intervals that betrayed Soviet logistical doctrine rather than the chaotic improvisation typical of purely indigenous operations. Tanner's pulse accelerated with the predatory focus that hunting triggers in human nervous systems unchanged since ancestors tracked prey across ancient grasslands. Except his weapons were rotating cannons, and the stakes involved geopolitical calculations that extended far beyond this jungle valley. He armed the gun systems, hearing electrical relays click with finality that transformed theoretical modifications into committed violence, the moment stretching as he rolled inverted and pulled the Thunderchiefs' nose toward Earth in an attack geometry never intended by Republic aviation engineers who had designed this aircraft for speed rather than the loitering gun runs he was attempting. The first burst lasted 3 seconds and felt like riding a jackhammer as Vulcan cannons vomited depleted uranium through darkness, tracers arcing downward in streams of light that seemed almost beautiful before they intersected with Soviet-built trucks that exploded into fireballs bright enough to ruin his night vision and turn the valley floor into flickering orange chaos. He pulled hard, feeling G-forces compress his chest, climbing away from his own destruction, while secondary explosions suggested ammunition or fuel stores, detonating in cascading failures that would leave craters visible from reconnaissance satellites that both superpowers would examine, with analysts trying to understand what new capability had entered this carefully managed proxy conflict. Banking for another pass, Tanner caught radio chatter in Vietnamese that his rudimentary language training couldn't fully pass, but the panicked tone required no translation. Defenders suddenly facing threat profiles they hadn't anticipated and couldn't counter with weapons designed for conventional attack profiles. The second gun run destroyed 4 more trucks before return fire began, green tracers floating upward with deceptive laziness that masked velocities capable of shredding aluminum and flesh with equal efficiency. He jinked right, then dropped toward terrain, using mountains to break visual contact while his mind performed calculations about fuel consumption and ammunition remaining, the cold arithmetic of sustained combat that separated survivors from casualties. In a profession where mistakes offered no second chances, small arms fire looked almost festive from altitude, muzzle flashes twinkling across hillsides like deadly constellations. But Tanner knew that somewhere in Hanoi, or maybe Moscow, duty officers were receiving reports about this attack and asking questions that would generate responses far more dangerous than rifles fired by frightened teenagers drafted into someone else's ideological struggle. He made 4 more passes across the valley until his ammunition counters approached 0, and fuel gauges demanded acknowledgement that physics remained unimpressed by tactical enthusiasm or strategic desperation. The convoy was finished, burning wreckage scattered across 3 kilometers of trail that would require weeks to clear, while supplies rotted or were scavenged by villagers who cared nothing for communist theory or capitalist containment doctrine. Tanner turned east toward Thailand, exhaustion replacing adrenaline as combat's chemical cocktail faded from his bloodstream, leaving only the hollowness that follows violence regardless of justification or necessity. His hands trembled slightly on controls as delayed stress response manifested in physiological symptoms that training helped manage but never eliminated, the primitive fear that waited until safety permitted its expression. Dawn was breaking over mountains when Tackley appeared ahead, the base waking to another day of authorized warfare, while he returned from a mission that existed in bureaucratic shadows, carrying evidence of effectiveness that would force decisions nobody wanted to make about escalation and restraint in a conflict already spinning beyond anyone's complete control. Landing felt almost anticlimactic after what he had done. Wheels touching concrete with their normal chirp, while tower controllers processed his arrival without suspecting that this particular Thunderchief had just killed perhaps 50 people and destroyed Soviet equipment worth millions of rubles in a single unauthorized night of violence. Davis waited near, the forgotten hangar, with expression carefully neutral, because survival in military institutions required knowing when ignorance provided better protection than knowledge, ready to hide modifications again beneath innocent panels and forged inspection records. Tanner shut down engines, hearing turbines wind down while his mind replayed the burning. Trucks and tracers and explosions, understanding that he had crossed a threshold that separated theoretical innovation from actual killing, that men were dead because of his obsession and skill, and that justification would be debated by people who had never felt a gunship shudder while dispensing industrial-scale violence into darkness. He climbed from the cockpit carrying the weight of proving his theory correct, while simultaneously unleashing consequences that would ripple through intelligence channels connecting Langley to Lubyanka, forcing responses from Soviet military planners who would recognize this attack as something new, requiring countermeasures that would escalate the shadow war into more dangerous territory where superpower proxies came closer to direct confrontation that everyone publicly claimed to avoid while privately preparing to wage. The summons arrived at dawn, delivered by an unsmiling captain whose pressed uniform suggested someone insulated from the war's actual dirt and blood, the paper ordering Tanner to report to Colonel Hendrick's office carrying the bureaucratic weight that could either validate everything or destroy his career with a single signature. Walking across the flight line, he watched F-105s launching for their authorized missions, while mechanics glanced at him with expressions mixing admiration and wariness, understanding that innovation in rigid military hierarchies often resulted in punishment rather than recognition, regardless of demonstrated effectiveness. The administration building felt oppressively air-conditioned after Thailand's humid heat. Fluorescent lights humming with electrical monotony while clerks typed reports that would be filed and forgotten in archives that preserved institutional memory without generating institutional learning. Hendricks waited behind a desk decorated with the sparse professionalism of career officers who measured success in promotions rather than tactical victories, his face revealing nothing while photographs of presidents and generals watched from walls like secular icons demanding obedience to hierarchies that transcended individual judgment. "Sit down, Captain," Hendricks said without preliminary courtesy, sliding a classified folder across the desk stamped with code words that indicated multiple intelligence agencies had reviewed Tanner's unauthorized night over Laos and formed opinions that would shape what happened next. "Your little experiment destroyed 23 vehicles, killed an estimated 40 to 60 personnel, and triggered flash traffic between Moscow and Hanoi that had the National Security Agency working triple shifts to decrypt responses." He paused, letting implications settle like sediment in disturbed water, the silence. "Carrying more threat than any direct accusation. You also violated about 15 regulations, risked an aircraft worth $3 million, and could have started an international incident if you'd been shot down and captured with experimental weapons systems that don't officially exist." The words hung between them, weighted with consequences. But Tanner noticed Hendricks hadn't mentioned court-martial yet, suggesting bureaucratic calculations were still in progress, somewhere up the chain of command where colonels became generals by reading political winds more skillfully than tactical maps. Soviet advisors in Hanoi are demanding explanations their Vietnamese hosts can't provide. Hendricks continued, opening the folder to reveal reconnaissance photographs showing Tanner's handiwork. Burned trucks scattered like discarded toys across terrain that looked almost peaceful in black and white imagery that sanitized violence into geometric patterns. They're moving ZSU-23-4 batteries into Laos, repositioning radar networks, and generally acting like someone just changed the rules of a game they thought they understood. He looked up with expression, finally showing something beyond bureaucratic neutrality, perhaps grudging respect mixed with the exhaustion of officers caught between tactical reality and strategic constraints. Washington wants to know if your concept is repeatable, scalable, and worth the diplomatic complications it's causing with Moscow during negotiations that apparently matter more than winning this damned war. The proposition emerged gradually through careful language designed to preserve deniability, Hendricks explaining that Tanner would receive conditional approval to form Project Gunhawk, with 4 modified Thunderchiefs operating under classification protocols that would erase their existence if political calculations demanded sacrifice. You'll face resistance from pilots who think you're crazy, mechanics who resent unauthorized modifications, and probably sabotage attempts from people who believe escalating this conflict serves nobody's interests, Hendricks warned, his tone carrying the weariness of someone who had watched too many good ideas die in committees. The Soviets will be hunting specifically for you now, and if you're captured, Washington will deny everything while Moscow parades you as proof of American aggression. He extended his hand across the desk, offering a bargain that promised brief authority purchased with unlimited risk. You've rattled the chessboard, Captain. Now let's see if you can win the game before the players decide to clear the board entirely. The intelligence briefing arrived 3 hours before sunset, grainy reconnaissance photographs showing a Soviet convoy assembling near Mugapas, carrying cargo that signals analysts identified as SA-2 guideline missile components, the kind of hardware that could shift air superiority and cost American lives in numbers that would generate headlines back home and questions in congressional hearings. Tanner spread the images across the planning table while his 3 other Gunhawk pilots studied terrain maps under red-filtered lights that preserved night vision. Each man understanding this target justified every risk because those missiles would kill their brothers in conventional strike aircraft who lacked the element of surprise that darkness and gunship tactics provided. The modified Thunderchiefs waited on the isolated, hard-stand like predatory birds, their side-mounted Vulcan cannons and cobbled-together night optics representing months of clandestine work that had transformed interceptors into nocturnal hunters capable of challenging Soviet doctrine itself. Lieutenant Kowalski traced the convoy route with fingers that trembled slightly, not from fear but from the combat pilot's anticipation that mixed dread with purpose, while Captain Morrison checked ammunition loads with the ritualistic precision of men who understood that mechanical failure at the wrong moment meant death screaming out of darkness without warning or mercy. They launched, as twilight bled into full darkness, 4 Thunderchiefs, climbing through tropical air that felt thick enough to touch, their formation loose and tactical rather than parade ground precise, because this mission operated beyond the boundaries of official doctrine, in spaces where improvisation mattered more than regulations. Tanner's cockpit glowed, with instrument lights casting green phosphorescence. Across his face, radio traffic reduced to essential brevity because Soviet listening posts tracked American frequencies and passed information to air defense networks that were learning to anticipate patterns and exploit predictability. The Mugia Pass appeared below as a black void between darker mountains, terrain so hostile that even map makers struggled to render its complexity accurately. while Tanner's primitive night optics translated the landscape into grainy green imagery that made the world look underwater and dreamlike. Then the convoy materialized, headlights moving in disciplined intervals that betrayed Soviet advisory influence, ZIL-157 trucks hauling their precious cargo southward, while somewhere nearby Shilka batteries waited with radar dishes, rotating through the darkness like mechanical sentinels serving Moscow's interests 8,000 miles from the Kremlin. The attack began with Tanner's first gun run, Vulcan cannons roaring with a sound like fabric tearing at cosmic scale, tracers arcing downward in streams of fire that seemed to connect heaven and earth through pure violence made visible. Trucks exploded in orange fireballs that briefly illuminated surrounding jungle, secondary detonations suggesting ammunition or fuel cooking off, while Soviet advisors somewhere below screamed coordinates into radio handsets trying to direct defenses against threats they couldn't see but only hear screaming overhead. Then the Shilkas opened fire, quad-barreled 23mm cannons pumping explosive rounds into the sky in patterns guided by radar that painted Tanner's Thunderchief with electronic precision, tracers rising like malevolent fireflies, seeking metal and flesh with impartial lethality. Morrison's voice crackled over radio reporting hits taken, his aircraft trailing fire while he fought for altitude. And Tanner recognized the terrible mathematics of combat, where victory and catastrophe occupied the same coordinates, and only luck determined which column your name entered in the ledger that historians would someday read. Without comprehending the actual cost, the engagement lasted 17 minutes that felt like hours, compressed into moments. All four Gunhawk Thunderchiefs making repeated passes, while Shilka batteries tracked and fired with increasing accuracy as Soviet tactics adapted in real time to American innovation. When Tanner finally called withdrawal, 12 trucks burned below, spreading smoke that rose like funeral pyres for doctrine and assumptions, while Morrison nursed his damaged aircraft toward Thailand, trailing hydraulic fluid that gleamed in moonlight like blood from wounded animals fleeing toward sanctuary. They had proven the concept again, demonstrated that gunship Thunderchiefs could challenge Soviet convoy operations even when defended by modern systems. But Tanner understood with cold certainty that Washington's tolerance for such provocations was finite, and political calculations in distant capitals would ultimately matter more than tactical victories won in darkness over terrain that appeared on classified maps, but rarely in public consciousness. The telegram arrived on a morning thick with monsoon humidity, delivered not by courier, but by a full colonel, whose pressed uniform and diplomatic expression conveyed the message before words were spoken that Project Gunhawk had become too successful for political comfort, and Washington required silence more than it valued tactical innovation. Tanner read the orders in his quarters while ceiling fans rotated overhead, pushing hot air in useless circles, each paragraph constructed with bureaucratic precision that transformed 3 months of combat achievement into operational liability because State Department analysts feared Soviet retaliation and diplomatic channels buzzed with Moscow's complaints about American escalation in theaters, where both superpowers pretended their involvement remained limited. The statistics haunted him, even as they justified termination. Over 300 Soviet-supplied vehicles destroyed, convoy operations along the trail disrupted to degrees that forced North Vietnamese logistics officers to recalculate supply timelines. But these victories generated exactly the kind of attention that made diplomats nervous during delicate negotiations where appearances mattered more than battlefield realities. His pilots received transfer orders, scattering them to conventional squadrons across Southeast Asia. Their knowledge of gunship tactics deemed too sensitive to concentrate in one location, while maintenance crews who had worked miracles with salvaged parts and improvised modifications found themselves reassigned before they could discuss their work with outsiders who might ask uncomfortable questions. The modified Thunderchiefs disappeared within 72 hours, flown to depots where mechanics stripped away the side-mounted cannons and night optics, returning the aircraft to factory specifications that erased physical evidence of innovation that had rattled Soviet confidence in their convoy defense doctrines. Tanner watched from the flight line as his flagship departed, the F-105D that had proven an engineer's obsession could become operational reality, now reduced to just another airframe in inventory systems that tracked metal and fuel consumption, but never captured the human ingenuity that transformed tools into weapons. Colonel Hastings found him there as afternoon thunderstorms built over distant mountains, offering a handshake and words about classified commendations that would remain locked in safes until decades passed and veterans were too old to matter. Recognition without acknowledgement because Cold War protocols demanded victories remain invisible when they complicated diplomacy. The colonel mentioned treaty negotiations in Geneva, where American and Soviet delegators maneuvered through formal language, while both sides understood that provocations in peripheral theaters could derail agreements that might prevent actual nuclear confrontation. And Tanner recognized his gunships had become pawns, sacrificed to preserve more important pieces on a chessboard whose dimensions exceeded his comprehension. Project Gunhawk vanished from official records through administrative alchemy that intelligence services had perfected, mission reports reclassified at levels that ensured historians would find only gaps and shadows when they eventually searched for truth. Tanner signed non-disclosure agreements whose legal language threatened prosecution for unauthorized disclosure, transforming his greatest achievement into a secret he would carry alone while conventional bombing campaigns continued with their predictable patterns and acceptable loss rates that generated no diplomatic complaints because they fit within established rules of engagement. Fellow officers who asked about the modified Thunderchiefs received polite deflections and topic changes, the institutional memory deliberately fragmenting until only rumors remained. Stories about night attacks that sounded too effective to be real, whispered in officer clubs by men who thought they might have imagined the whole thing. He understood with bitter clarity that wars were fought on multiple levels simultaneously. Battlefield tactics subordinate to strategic considerations, which themselves served political objectives determined by civilians who measured success in negotiating positions rather than enemy trucks burning in darkness, and his innovation had disrupted balances that powerful men in distant capitals needed maintained, regardless of what soldiers accomplished in jungles that appeared on classified maps, but rarely in newspapers that shaped public understanding. The final briefing occurred in a room stripped of materials, walls blank, except for required security posters, Tanner facing intelligence officers who confirmed Soviet awareness of Project Gunhawk through signals, intercepts and debriefings of captured personnel who had survived attacks by aircraft that didn't match known American tactics. Moscow had escalated defensive deployments specifically to counter his gunships, diverting resources that might otherwise have gone elsewhere, and this success paradoxically justified termination because Washington feared the tactical innovation would force Soviet responses that could spiral beyond anyone's control in a war already delicate enough without adding new variables. They thanked him for his service with the same institutional courtesy used to dismiss inconvenient truths, promising that someday, when treaties were signed and tensions eased, his contributions might receive proper acknowledgement. But everyone in that room understood that particular someday existed in the same category as other comfortable fictions that helped maintain order in organizations built on secrets. Tanner left Thailand 3 weeks later on a transport filled with rotating personnel, the jungle canopy below concealing trails where Soviet trucks still moved southward, carrying weapons that would kill Americans because diplomatic considerations had taken precedence over tactical advantages. and he carried home the knowledge that even victories could be erased when they complicated the careful choreography through which superpowers avoided the ultimate confrontation that would end everything. Tanner returned to the United States in the spring of 1969 aboard a commercial flight that carried servicemen in civilian clothes who avoided discussing where they had been or what they had done. The unspoken protocol of men returning from a war that existed in newspapers but remained incomprehensible to citizens who read casualty figures without understanding the complexity of conflicts fought in jungles half a world away. He processed out at Travis Air Force Base through administrative channels designed for efficiency rather than ceremony, signing forms that confirmed his security clearances, remained active, and his knowledge of classified programs would follow him like invisible shackles that prevented honest conversations about the most significant work of his career. The engineering position waiting for him at Wright-Patterson involved aircraft systems analysis, respectable work evaluating proposals from defense contractors whose designs existed only on paper, while his modifications had proven themselves in combat that would never appear in any evaluation report or promotion packet. He rented an apartment in Dayton, where neighbors asked polite questions about his service, and he offered polite evasions, becoming one of thousands of veterans who carried secrets that isolated them from civilians who assumed they understood war from television footage that showed only fragments of truth, carefully edited for audiences eating dinner in living rooms, insulated from consequences. The years accumulated with bureaucratic steadiness as Tanner progressed through assignments that utilized his technical skills while carefully avoiding anything that might remind superiors of his unauthorized innovations. His personnel file, containing notations visible only to those with appropriate clearances, that marked him as both brilliant and problematic. He attended conferences where engineers discussed theoretical improvements to combat aircraft, while he remained silent about practical modifications that had actually worked, the classification system creating absurd situations where he possessed knowledge that could advance discussions, but regulations prevented him from contributing anything beyond generic observations that frustrated colleagues who sensed he knew more than he revealed. Occasionally, he encountered former Project Gunhawk personnel at professional gatherings, recognition passing between them in careful glances and brief conversations that avoided specifics. Men bound by shared experience they could never fully discuss, even among themselves, because walls had ears and careers could still be damaged by unauthorized disclosures. The war in Southeast Asia ground toward its chaotic conclusion through negotiations that vindicated the diplomatic priorities that had shut down his program, though Tanner noted with grim satisfaction that historians would eventually debate whether different tactical approaches might have produced better outcomes if political considerations had not constantly overridden military innovation. Declassification came in the late 1990s through bureaucratic processes that released documents after sufficient decades had passed, that revelations no longer threatened active operations or living officials whose decisions might face uncomfortable scrutiny. Tanner was retired by then, living in a suburb where former colleagues gradually discovered through Freedom of Information Act requests and researcher inquiries that the quiet engineer had once rattled Soviet convoy operations badly enough to generate Politburo discussions intercepted by intelligence services that documented Moscow's concern about American tactical innovations. They had not anticipated. A military aviation historian conducting research for a book about unconventional weapons programs found fragmentary references to Project Gunhawk in newly released files and tracked Tanner down through veteran networks, their interview lasting 6 hours as the old engineer finally spoke freely about modifications and missions that had existed in bureaucratic limbo between achievement and erasure. The historian's book devoted an entire chapter to the gunship Thunderchiefs, contextualizing Tanner's work within the larger narrative of Cold War proxy conflicts, where superpowers tested capabilities while carefully managing escalation, and suddenly the silence that had surrounded his greatest accomplishment began dissolving as researchers recognized the significance of what had been deliberately forgotten. Recognition arrived in forms both official and personal, as defense journals published articles analyzing Project Gunhawk's tactical effectiveness, and aviation museums requested interviews for oral history, archives that would preserve veteran experiences before that generation disappeared entirely. The Air Force issued a belated commendation acknowledging his contributions to combat aviation development, the ceremony small and polite, with a general who had not been born when Tanner flew his modified Thunderchief over Laotian jungles reading citations that reduced 3 months of intensity into bureaucratic language that somehow missed the essential truth of what innovation meant when lives depended on it. Former pilots from his unit emerged from decades of silence, gathering at a reunion where old men compared memories and filled gaps in each other's recollections, their conversations mixing technical details with emotional confessions about carrying secrets that had shaped their lives in ways families never fully understood. Tanner stood before them, offering no speeches or grand pronouncements, simply acknowledging that they had proven a determined crew could shift balances even in conflicts controlled by superpowers who thought individual ingenuity could be managed and contained. And though history had tried to erase their achievement, the truth eventually surfaced because suppressed facts possess gravity that pulls them toward light, regardless of how many layers of classification are piled on top. What would you have done if your greatest achievement had to remain secret for 30 years? Subscribe to explore more untold stories from the Cold War's shadows.